I'd been at the company long enough to know when something felt off. It started with the email. Greg, the CEO, called for a department-wide meeting to announce a shift in leadership. Nothing too alarming at first, but I had a feeling in my gut that something was coming for me, something I wasn't going to like. When I walked into the conference room, I saw Jeff sitting there. Jeff, my former intern, the one I'd trained from scratch, teaching him everything he knew about systems, infrastructure, the core of our business. Now, he was sitting next to Greg, a shiny new title on his lapel that I knew damn well didn't belong to him. Not when I'd been the one running the company's infrastructure for years, quietly, behind the scenes. No glory, no recognition. Just the satisfaction of knowing things worked because of me. Greg cleared his throat, all smooth and rehearsed, and started talking about growth, innovation, new energy, bullshit corporate talk. But then he dropped the bomb. "Everyone, meet Jeff, our new co-lead." My stomach dropped. I'm sure no one noticed, but I swear I felt every drop of sweat on the back of my neck. Greg's words stung, but it wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, like he was introducing a hero. Jeff, the golfing champ with a corporate smile and about as much technical knowledge as a cardboard cutout. I waited for a mention of me, my work, something, anything. But no. Greg raved about Jeff's leadership skills, how Jeff had fresh ideas and a vision for the future. Not a single mention of my years of sweat, my countless late nights. No mention of the work that made the platform tick, not even a thank you. Then came the applause. I sat there, a ghost in the room, clapping along with everyone else, forced, empty. It felt like my dignity was being stripped away in front of everyone. I couldn't even bring myself to join in. That was the moment I knew. I was being phased out. Jeff was the shiny new toy, and I was the old relic. But as I sat there, hands stiff, clapping mechanically, I realized something. This wasn't about fighting back with anger. No, I'd do this differently. I'd make them regret this, quietly, methodically. As I filed out of that meeting, I started planning. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was my legacy. And I was going to make damn sure it stayed mine. The next few days felt like I was invisible. I showed up to work, but the office didn't feel like it was mine anymore. My calendar, cleared. My emails, unanswered. Every meeting I'd normally be part of, suddenly I wasn't needed. I walked past conference rooms where discussions were happening, but no one even looked up. Like I was just another office plant, rooted in place, but ignored. I'd spent years keeping this company running, and now I was barely an afterthought. I knew what was happening, of course. Greg and Jeff were pushing me out. It wasn't even subtle anymore, but instead of getting angry, I stayed quiet. Let them think they'd won. I had other things to focus on, like figuring out how to turn this all around. One afternoon, I grabbed a coffee and wandered into the break room. My fingers were still sore from typing up some code for a system Jeff would probably claim he'd come up with in a few weeks, but I didn't care. I was about to hear exactly what I needed to hear. Greg and Jeff were standing by the vending machine, chatting like old pals. Jeff was laughing at something Greg said, but then I caught a few words that froze me in place. "The new direction," Greg was saying. "Tom's legacy is a good lesson in what happens when you move too slowly. You can't just sit back and wait for things to happen anymore." I couldn't believe it. My legacy was a lesson? A cautionary tale? They didn't even have the decency to pretend I mattered. I wanted to walk up to them, shove their fake smiles right off their faces. But I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, staring down at the coffee cup in my hand, letting it go cold in my grip. I wasn't going to fight this with words. I knew that now. The only way out of this was to take what was mine and use it against them. They wanted to erase me? Fine. Let them. I'd build a paper trail, one they couldn't deny. They could push me out all they wanted, but I was going to make sure I walked away with what was owed to me. So that's what I did. I started reviewing old documents, my employment contract, patents, the intellectual property I'd created. I wasn't expecting to find anything groundbreaking. I just needed to make sure I wasn't missing something. Something that could give me an edge when the time came. And that's when I found it, a clause buried in the fine print. One I hadn't even noticed before. If I was terminated without cause, I retained the rights to the intellectual property I'd created. It was like a punch to the gut, and then a cold rush of relief. I wasn't just another employee. I was the damn foundation of this company. Every system, every platform, every key piece of tech, that was mine. And if they wanted to pretend I was irrelevant, fine. But they'd have to pay for it. I smiled to myself. They thought they could erase me, but they were about to find out I wasn't going anywhere. And the best part? I was doing this on my terms, quietly, smartly. Now, I had something to hold over their heads, and it felt damn good. I kept my head down and worked. It felt different now, like I wasn't just putting in time anymore. Every line of code, every email, every meeting, I made sure to document it. I couldn't afford to let anything slip through the cracks. I kept meticulous records of every email thread, every project update, every commit I'd ever made. I knew what they were doing, and I wasn't going to let them erase me that easily. I still showed up to work like I was a part of the team, pretending nothing had changed. I even went out of my way to ask Greg for small tasks now and then, just to keep up the appearance of being involved. But in reality, I was focusing on something else, on building my case. I started slipping into the legal department more often. Not that I was obvious about it. I wasn't trying to raise alarms, just casual visits. I'd wander in with a smile, ask about some vague, harmless clause in my contract. Something about personal planning, estate stuff, always something to throw them off the scent. But with every visit, I was picking up pieces of the puzzle, little bits of information that, over time, would come together. They didn't suspect a thing. To them, I was just another guy dotting the I's on his personal business. But I was putting together something much bigger. After a few weeks of this routine, I got a piece of gold, a list. The company's internal database had a record of contributions, patents, and everything tied to the platform. And guess what? My name was on it. My name was on every major piece of intellectual property in the company. The patents, the systems, the architecture, it all pointed back to me. I took a deep breath when I saw it. They couldn't deny it now. They might try to play it off like Jeff was the one calling the shots, like Greg was the one with the vision, but I knew better. I was the foundation of everything that worked around here. If they tried to push me out, they'd have to deal with the truth sooner or later. The contract wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a lifeline. It meant they couldn't just push me out without consequences. I had the right to everything I'd built here. If they wanted to terminate me without cause, they'd have to face the music. It wasn't just leverage, it was the final piece of the puzzle. I had everything I needed to make sure they couldn't get away with this. But I wasn't about to rush into it. I had to be careful. I had to be smart. One wrong move, and they'd see me coming from a mile away. So I kept working, quietly. But now I worked with a different kind of purpose. One that was mine. It didn't take long for Greg and Jeff to start publicly pushing me out. It wasn't even subtle anymore. Every time they spoke about the company's progress, it was like I never existed. They'd talk about fresh blood and new energy, like the entire company had been revived overnight. Jeff's shiny corporate smile was everywhere now, his name attached to things I'd spent years building. It was like my work was being erased in real time. Jeff, now co-lead, started making major changes to the systems I'd spent the last decade developing, the same systems that ran smoothly, that kept the company afloat. And now, he was tearing them apart. I could feel it every time I looked at the updates. Things that worked perfectly fine were being swapped out for half-baked ideas that would have failed the moment they were tested. But Jeff didn't care. He wasn't interested in what worked. He was interested in looking good. One afternoon, I overheard Greg in the hallway, bragging to a new investor about the massive improvements they'd made to the platform. "We've streamlined the whole thing," he said, practically glowing. "Jeff's leadership has been a game changer. Not a single mention of me. Not a word about the foundation that I'd built. It was as if the years of my work had never even happened. I felt a knot in my stomach, tight and furious, but I didn't let it show. Not yet. It was getting harder to ignore. They were rewriting the company's story, and I wasn't even a footnote. But that was the thing. They were pushing me out because they thought they could get away with it. They thought I'd just sit back and take it. But I wasn't going to let them. I began making backups of everything. Every line of code, every log, every system, every email exchange where I had a hand in key decisions. I made sure to cover every angle. I had copies of everything I needed. Even if they tried to erase my involvement, I'd have it all. I'd have proof of my work, and no one could take that away from me. Not Greg, not Jeff, and certainly not their new vision. I wasn't about to strike out at them out of anger, not yet. I was smarter than that. I kept my frustration to myself, but inside, the fire was growing. I knew what I had to do. The legal department was my next stop. I didn't just need to gather evidence anymore. I needed to ensure they couldn't touch a thing I'd built, not legally anyway. It was time to get serious, time to play my cards. I could feel the resolve settling in, solidifying in my chest. They thought they had control, but I was the one holding the trump card, and when the time came, I was going to make sure they couldn't deny it. I was invited to the shareholder meeting that afternoon, and as soon as I stepped into the room, I knew it was a show, one that I wasn't supposed to be a part of. Greg and Jeff were up front, all smiles, standing next to a big projector screen with the company's new logo. They were ready to roll out this new direction they'd been building. As the presentation started, I sat at the back, doing my best to appear just another face in the crowd. They talked about how the company had reached new heights, how the leadership team had pushed the company into a new era. There was no mention of me, no mention of my work. I knew I wasn't going to hear anything about the systems I built, or the platform I spent years perfecting. But still, it stung like hell. They kept pushing Jeff's vision and how his leadership had brought about all these transformations. They painted a picture of the future, one where Jeff was the mastermind, the guiding force. I watched it unfold, and my blood boiled. They were pretending like the entire platform, everything that made the company valuable, was theirs, their brainchild. Like I hadn't spent the last decade building it from the ground up. The shareholders clapped politely when they finished speaking. Their applause felt like a slap. They didn't know what was really happening here, didn't know what was being erased, and they didn't care. But I wasn't about to just sit there and let them do it. I wasn't going to clap. I wasn't going to smile and nod like I was some part of their little act. I stood up instead, slowly. It was quiet, the kind of silence that makes everyone turn their heads. "Excuse me," I said, my voice clear but calm. "Before we go any further, I'd like to ask for something to be read into the record." Greg's face tightened. He could feel it. He knew what I was doing, but he tried to play it off. "Tom, I think we're done here," he said, trying to brush me off with a forced smile. "We've covered everything." But I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to let him ignore me. "I think it's important," I continued, keeping my tone steady, "for the legal department to read a specific clause from my employment contract. It pertains to my contributions to the company and how they're tied to my rights as an employee. I'd appreciate it if we could address it now." The room went still. No one said anything. Greg's smile faltered for a second, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He was trying to figure out how to stop this, how to bury it before it could do any real damage. He tried to move things along, his voice getting a little sharper. "Tom, this isn't the time or the place." But it was too late. The wheels were already in motion. I'd made sure of that. The general counsel was sitting nearby, and before Greg could shut me down completely, I saw her look at him, then at me. She stood up and, without a word, started reading from my contract. Section 8.4. In the event of termination without cause, all intellectual property developed by the employee shall remain the property of the employee. This includes, but is not limited to, all software, patents, and systems created during the term of employment. The room was dead silent now. I stayed calm, watching Greg's face slowly drain of color. The truth was out. They couldn't hide behind their lies anymore. Every update they'd made, every claim they'd made about innovation, it all traced back to me. And now, they couldn't pretend it didn't. Greg's eyes flickered nervously toward the legal team, then back to me. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He couldn't say anything, not with the legal department in the room. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't just about leverage anymore. This was the moment when everything turned in my favor. They thought they could erase me. They thought they could rewrite the story. But now, it was my story to tell. The general counsel finished reading the clause, and the room went completely still. The words hung in the air, thick with a kind of tension that felt almost suffocating. I stayed where I was, watching. No one spoke at first, but I could see the shift in the room, the unease spreading like a wave. Greg's face turned pale, the smile he'd been wearing slipping like it was never real to begin with. His eyes darted around the room, looking for something to latch onto, some way out of the mess I'd just thrown him into. Jeff, on the other hand, sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, like he'd just realized everything he'd built his future on was built on sand. It didn't take long for the panic to set in. I could hear murmurs rippling through the crowd of shareholders and investors. They began looking at each other, pulling out their phones, making quiet calls. A few leaned in close, exchanging worried glances. They didn't know what to do. They'd been told a story where Greg and Jeff were the heroes, the visionaries. And now the story had unraveled in front of their eyes. Greg cleared his throat, trying to reclaim some control. This is a misunderstanding, he said, his voice strained, rising with false confidence. But his eyes betrayed him. What Tom is claiming, it's not... I didn't let him finish. I'm not claiming anything, I said, my voice steady, louder than I intended. I'm just stating facts. The contract is clear. And with that, the room froze again, everyone processing the reality of what this meant. The platform, the one they'd been celebrating, was mine. Every line of code, every system, every patent, the backbone of the company, all traced back to me. I watched as Greg's facade cracked. It was like watching a glass shatter in slow motion. His usual polished confidence was gone, replaced with the kind of panic you don't see from someone who's used to being in charge. Jeff shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand trembling slightly as he tried to adjust his tie, like some minor physical gesture would fix everything. I didn't feel satisfied. Not yet. This wasn't just about getting back at them. It was about taking back what I'd built, about ensuring they couldn't erase me from this. Investors started making calls, some in quiet corners, others in the middle of the room, their voices rising in urgency. I could hear words like liabilities and reassess being tossed around. I didn't need to be part of the conversation to know what was happening. They were realizing, too late, that the entire company's value had been built on my work, and now that asset was being yanked out from under them. Greg and Jeff tried to salvage the situation by offering me a payout. Greg was the first to approach me, his voice tight, trying to sound reasonable. Tom, we can work something out. A severance, a payout, something fair. Let's get this behind us. It was tempting in a way. It would have been easy to take the money, walk away, and let them try to patch the hole I was leaving behind. But it wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my work, and my future. I'm not interested in a payout, I said. I want my work, all of it. You can't erase what I've built. Greg's jaw tightened. He could see I wasn't going to back down, that this wasn't something he could smooth over with a check. The room was in chaos now. People were talking over each other, the board members in a panic, scrambling to figure out what to do next. Greg and Jeff looked like they'd lost control, like everything they thought they had was slipping away. I stayed calm, watching it unfold. It was only the beginning, and they knew it. But as the board floundered, trying to come up with a plan to save face, I made my next move. Quietly, without drawing attention, I secured a position at another company, one that aligned with my values, where I wasn't just a cog in a machine, where I wasn't going to be erased by corporate politics. It was a step forward, but not just for me. It was a step away from the mess Greg and Jeff had created. And when it was all said and done, I'd have what was mine, and they'd have to rebuild from the ground up, without me. I walked out of the shareholder meeting without a word. I didn't need to say anything more. Greg and Jeff were left scrambling, trying to explain themselves, trying to put the pieces of their shattered facade back together. But I wasn't going to stick around for their charade. I'd said my piece. The rest was out of my hands now. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt the weight lifting off my shoulders, but not in a triumphant way. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about getting back at them for what they'd done or trying to show them who was really in charge. It was about reclaiming something that was mine all along. My dignity, my work, my future. I was done letting them control me. I was done letting them take credit for what I'd built. I kept walking, not rushing, but not lingering either. There was no need to look back. I wasn't attached to that place anymore. I didn't need their approval, their recognition, their validation. All of that had been stripped away long ago. And now, with the contract in my pocket and my intellectual property rights secured, I knew they could never take what I'd built. Not in the way they thought they could. As I stepped out of the building and into the cold air, I paused for just a moment, breathing in the quiet. It felt different out here, free. The city was still bustling, people rushing by, completely unaware of the battle I'd just won. But it didn't matter. I wasn't tied to that place anymore. That toxic environment where I'd spent so many years giving pieces of myself to a company that never appreciated it. I pulled out my phone as I walked to my car, checking a few messages. The job at the new company was secure. It was everything I'd been looking for, aligned with my values, a place where I could build something real without the politics, without the games. I could already feel the future taking shape, and this time, it was on my terms. The next day I got the call. The company was falling apart. Greg and Jeff's attempt to restructure had collapsed. Without the platform I'd built, the core of their success, they were floundering. The investors were pulling out, the staff was scattering, and they had no idea how to fix it. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel vindicated. But I did feel something. I felt like I'd finally taken control of my life. I wasn't part of their mess anymore. I was free. As I drove toward my next opportunity, the sun setting low on the horizon, I realized I didn't need to see them fail to know I'd won. My victory wasn't in watching them crumble. It was in walking away, knowing I had what I needed, and they'd never be able to claim what I'd built again.